Hi, everyone. We're here today to answer a question that my friend Eduardo and I are frequently asked, which is how did we become fluent in English? And uh, thank you very much for having accepted this invitation. It's great to have you here. And I think it's important I would like to mention from the very beginning that the reason why you and I decided to record this video in English, it's because, well, number one, we have students right from other countries, not just Brazilian students. And we know that this is a question that a lot of people from different countries are interested in. They would like to know how other people from different countries also achieved fluency. And that's why we're here today to discuss this question. I think it's also important to mention that Du and I have something in common. Well, we're both English teachers, have been English teachers for a long time. And most importantly, we have achieved fluency living in Brazil. We didn't have to go abroad to study, even though we did, after a long time, but we were able to go from like complete beginners to C2 level of proficiency, only living and studying here in Brazil. Would you like to share a little about yourself before we really get into the topic and start discussing how we achieved fluency living in Brazil?
Oh, yes. You know, something funny about Sergio and I is that I met Sergio when I was 14 years old. We were doing Senai, a technical course.
True.
And after that, we decided that we had a passion for language. And we have the same age. We live in the same city, so we have many things in common. So I remember from the very first beginning of my language learning, Sergio was there. And since the beginning, we had the chance to share many of our experiences together. And we are going to talk about those experiences today, right, Serge?
Exactly. And I think that probably this is the best segue into this discussion. I think that one of the things that helped us a lot, both you and I, was the fact that even though we were living in Brazil and we started studying, we have always tried to expose ourselves to English as much as possible. And I think that this should be our first tip, right? For those who are there listening to us and are wondering, okay, how can I become fluent if I don't have the opportunity to go abroad, spend some time abroad, and have contact with native speakers of the language? I would say, and I would like to hear your opinion when it comes to that, that exposure is essential. It's key. There's no way for someone to achieve fluency in one language if they don't get enough exposure. What is your take on that, Du?
Yeah, I think it comes down to your motivation. So when you are motivated to learn the language, whatever your motivation is could it be because it could be because you like the language, you want to get a better job, you want to study abroad. Whatever the situation is you need to find a motivation. Once you have a motivation, you will naturally try to find ways to expose yourself to the language. I remember when we started studying English, I really liked MTV, which
Mm-hmm.
was a TV program on television. And the TV presenters, they always interviewed international guys, American guys, British guys. And I wanted to understand their interviews. And I was fascinated to see how well they could speak the language. And also, I liked the video clips. So I would say in the very beginning, what really helped me
Mm-hmm.
to be exposed to the language was my motivation to watch video clips. So sometimes when you think about motivation and exposure, it does not necessarily need to come from books. So
Mm-hmm.
whatever you think is something that makes you happy, you should take this opportunity and get the exposure to the language. Do you agree?
Definitely. I think it makes a lot of sense when you say that you should try to combine, for example, your desire, your willingness to learn the language with something that is appealing and attractive. Because I think that when I think like in hindsight, when I look at my students, the ones who have really made a lot of progress in a short time are the ones that were able to combine, like they had the best of both worlds, right? They had a lot of exposure through topics and things that they were absolutely passionate about. So yes. But I think that a common question is, especially from students, does anything count as input? Because okay, we're basically saying to people who are listening to us, you should find your passion, you should find things that you are attracted to, expose yourself to English as much as possible. But does anything that somebody, for example, listens to or reads can be considered good input?
Well, today I would say no. I remember when I started studying English, I had a different view on it. I remember very clearly that I would, for example, get songs and try to understand the whole song, but I was a basic student. So
Hmm.
I would overload my mind with information that I wouldn't recall after 5 minutes, and I couldn't feel any improvement. I just remember the very first moment when I decided to buy some books and to narrow down what I was studying to my level. And I had this inner sensation that, oh, this is not the way it's working. Although I didn't have any studies on this, I started to see that the comprehensible input, the name we have today, was the way to go. So I started to analyze, like, hey, I'm learning, I don't know, present perfect. So I just go for the songs that you have present perfect and try to understand why they are using there. And about the vocabulary, I started reading graded readers and I started to have grammar books and everything that was within my level. And I think it started making all the difference because I could feel the evolution. Otherwise, you feel overwhelmed and you don't feel a progress. And even if you, for example, you memorize the whole lyrics of a song, you won't be able to use this on your daily routine because this is not your level, or most of the words there, they are not exactly what you need first. So I think you should have a comprehensible input, which is see the level where you are, and then what is the next thing you should be learning so that you are really having progress on the language.
Hmm. And I think that a frequent, because you said right back then when you started, you didn't even know what comprehensible input was, and it's the same. I didn't know that there was such a thing called comprehensible input. Uh, but then, when we became teachers, we really were able to understand how important it is to get input that you can extract meaning from. And I think that this is a very common mistake because when people start learning a language, they get especially in these days, right? That you have a lot of people on YouTube making suggestions, giving advice, telling you what to do, what not to do. And then you have people who tell you, okay, you should watch movies. I okay, it's great to watch movies. I have nothing against it. But if you are a beginner, I think the main problem is you're going to understand, let's say, 5% of it tops. So there's 95% of the movie that you're not going to be able to understand, unless, of course, you have the subtitles in your language. So the question is that input, and I think that's the main problem, becomes just noise because you're not able to listen to it and make sense of the information, of the input you are receiving. And one thing that we know these days as English teachers is that meaning is key, right? The first thing that you should try to get from a message, whatever message you're talking about, is the meaning. So if you're not able to listen to something and make sense of it, it's just noise. So I think that what you said about getting comprehensible input is essential.
And Sergio, something that really helped me a lot is similar to what you said in our last video. What happens is sometimes we start as English teachers when we are not that fluent, you know. So
True.
I was at B1 level and I started teaching the language, and I had a great coordinator that he would watch my classes and pinpoint mistakes like, "Oh, Eduardo,
Mhm.
you have a hard time working on your own pronunciation. You have a hard time on developing advanced sentences or doing something more advanced. Why don't you learn about phrasal verbs? I have never heard you using any phrasal verbs in your conversation." And I even didn't know what phrasal verbs was. So
Mhm.
there I went for phrasal verbs, something really specific. And then he would guide me through all the way to reach the fluency, So what helped me a lot was start preparing for the Cambridge exams. The first
Mhm.
one was the first certificate. And on that, I was forced to improve my writing. I had never written in English. And then I had to study grammar, but the specific grammar to that level. And then when I finished the first certificate, I did this with the advanced and the proficiency. So the exams ended up being a very nice tool to help me improve the language because they gave me exactly the level of the language that I needed it at the right moment.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think we could even, later on think about recording another episode, another conversation talking about the role that exams played, right, in our development, not just as teachers, but as users of the language. So, dude, do you think that it's fair to say that, as far as our first point is concerned, the most important thing when it comes to I mean, let's say the main step towards fluency is exposing to getting a lot of exposure to the language, and make sure that what the input you're getting, be it through reading a text or listening to whatever, it could be a podcast or watching a movie, but this input you're getting must be as comprehensible as possible, so then it makes sense to you.
Exactly. I would say that the exposure by exposure, for the sake of exposure only, won't lead you to the fluency. You need to have a guide, and you need to have a specific knowledge of where you are and where you want to be. And then knowing exactly the gap, you will find the best way to do this. So it's exposure, but it's an analytical exposure to your necessities.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I think that when you say, yeah, because you're being selective, right? You're not just, when you said it's not exposure for the sake of exposure. Yeah, I feel that when I've tried to learn other languages, even though I haven't I haven't succeeded. I mean, unfortunately, I haven't been uh, successful in achieving the same level that I did in English because I didn't put so much effort into it. But I feel that once I understood what I had to do, it was much easier because then I knew the steps that I had to take. And it was not just a question, for example, if I want to improve my Spanish, to start watching Spanish movies. So it's not going to be that helpful. So do, what do you think? Shall we move on to the second point?
Yes?
Excellent. So, okay, so exposure and input, point number one. Number two, uh, practice. One of the things that I believe, and I believe that you and I share the same belief, is that even though exposure is key, it's not enough, right? We need something else to help us achieving the fluency that everybody wants to achieve. So when it comes to practicing, do you think that there is an effective way of practicing the language, or any sort of practice is effective, can be considered effective?
Yeah, I think there are two different aspects here. The first one is about working memory. So, whenever you are practicing the language, you are going deeper into that vocabulary or that expression. So, whenever you are practicing, you can help and boost your memory, and you will retrieve the information better. But it doesn't mean that by doing that you are doing the right thing. I mean, if you don't have someone to monitor you and to help you, you can end up making mistakes and you won't be aware of the mistakes, because how can you be aware of your own mistakes? And there is a problem when you are learning a second language, which is sometimes you don't recognize the mistake because it's a new language, it's a new pattern, and just transferring what you know in your L1 to L2 will not be enough.
Yeah,
Do you agree?
I do. I do. And I think it's important to say that because then some people think that, okay, practicing, it can be too broad a term, right? When you say, well, it's important to practice. But I know, for example, people who moved to an English speaking country, and then they did have the opportunity to interact with native speakers and non-native speakers of English. So you could say that, yeah, they were like practicing, they were having the opportunity to experiment with the language. But I would say that it was very frustrating, based on their accounts, that because one of the problems was, if you compare the kind of practice that these people have, which is not controlled, right? I mean, you really have to try to convey your ideas in order to get something done for a practical purpose. And maybe that person who's interacting with you is not aware of your limitations as someone who's still learning the language. So this interaction between you and someone else, be it a native speaker or a non-native speaker, outside the classroom can be extremely challenging, as opposed, for example, to the conditions, right, that we try to create for students to practice the language in the context of the classroom. So when you say that about the importance of creating an environment, like a safe environment, where students will be able to practice the language according to what they're studying, or focusing on the target language that they are studying that particular lesson. And I mean, on top of that, receive feedback. is what, in my opinion, makes practice effective.
Yeah, and what happens is, for example, when you move to another country, you start to copy what people were saying. So first, you don't have this analytical skill to see why the person is saying the sentence the way it is. And maybe when you try to transform or make a new sentence, you can make a mistake, number one. And number two, you never know if when you are saying something, the other person is understanding exactly what you are trying to say, because sometimes the person kind of understand what you are saying and you think, wow, I'm fluent, people understand me, but they are not understanding exactly the message you are trying to transmit. So that's why it's important to have somebody monitoring you and analyzing if what you are trying to say is exactly, you are using the exact words you should be using to transmit the message. Yeah. So because even in Portuguese, how many times in your life you said something and then
Mhm.
another Brazilian native person understood something different? So if it's a problem in Portuguese, let alone in English, it's another, which is another language. So this is the problem when you live in another country. Sometimes you think you speak well, but the way you transmit the message is not exactly transmitting the message you want to provide.
Yeah, and by no means we're saying that it doesn't work, right? We know, of course it works. If we know, you and I know people who moved to an English speaking country and learned the language. But one of the things that I would say that whenever someone tells me about their experience of learning a language in the country where it's spoken, they do have this. Normally, it has this negative connotation because they suffered a lot. It was very hard for them at first. And I think that once you do that in the classroom, and then you have someone to guide you, and give you feedback, the process becomes much easier. So I think that we could say that when it comes to practicing the language, okay, there are different types of practice, right? And some are definitely effective, uh, more effective than others. Do, which leads us to the third point, which is about the importance of having someone to guide you. And what I'm talking about here is a teacher, a professional, a person who can help you learn the language as effectively as possible. And here's my question for you. Once somebody made a very good point. The person asked me, "Can I?" And I still remember this example because I think this example really illustrates the point we're trying to make. Somebody asked me, "Can I practice my speaking outside the classroom?" I said, "Of course you can practice your speaking outside the classroom. What about my reading?" I said, "Sure. So you can read. Theoretically, you can practice all the four skills right outside the classroom. You're reading, you're writing, you're listening, you're speaking." Um, but then I asked this person, "But what about feedback? Can you get good feedback outside the classroom?" In theory, you can, but it's highly unlikely that someone, for example, who is just a native speaker of the language, or a highly competent user of the language, will be able to pay attention to what you're saying and helping you say it better, just like a teacher can do in the context of the classroom. And when you said that you may have the impression that what you're saying is correct, and people may be understanding you, sometimes that's not the case. So much so that we know a lot of people, right, that learned English in an English speaking country, and by the time they came back to Brazil, there were so many mistakes. Uh, in English teaching, we often use the term fossilized, right? When a mistake gets fossilized, meaning that they have made this mistake for so long and nobody corrected them, that it became ingrained. So it's very difficult to fix those mistakes because they're there, like they incorporate them. So here's my question for you in terms of feedback. To what extent do you feel that a good teacher, a good professional, can help you speed up the process of learning the language, of reaching fluency by providing you with good feedback?
Yeah. First, what I think you and I have in common, Sergio, is that we were willing to get feedback from the others, because well, as teacher today, experienced teachers, we can say that sometimes the students they face two problems about feedback. Or they play the victim, like, oh, I'm so stupid, I can't speak the language, I have so many problems. So whenever you give feedback, the person starts to criticize himself or herself about this. So they don't know how to take the feedback. Number one. Or second, they try to find justification. Ah, really? I made this mistake because blah, 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 blah. So justifying or trying to play the victim won't help you no matter how good your instructor is. So I think the mindset would make the difference. And you should be willing to get the feedback. So when you pay a personal trainer to go when you go to the gym and you pay a personal trainer, you are so happy that he's helping you to adjust the movements and all the things. But when it comes to language, I don't know why there is a barrier, and many people they feel uncomfortable receiving the feedback. So apart from having a great teacher, you needed to be open and willing to get the feedback and try to understand how to incorporate the suggestions that your teacher gave to you. And as a teacher, we need to be resourceful. We need to know how to help our students in the four skills and in different moments and take into account their level. So, for example, if you have a basic one student, he won't be able to produce the TH sound perfectly. And you shouldn't be correcting him every 2 seconds because that would kind of traumatize. Now I'm criticizing us as teacher if we play a hard role model on students, so you need to select the level of feedback you are giving which is appropriate to that moment to that student and take into account his speed of evolution. Do you agree?
Yes, yes. I think that if I had, well, again, if I think about my experience as an English learner, if I hadn't had a great teacher, someone who was like listening to me, and giving me feedback in a way that it was, as you said, I don't remember, for example, getting feedback. And I think I was very lucky because none of the teachers that I've had, I mean, throughout my life, were teachers that made me frustrated when I received feedback. They were very tactful. They were able to provide me feedback in a way that I could see that they were really willing to help me, to 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 guide me in order to become a better speaker, or even when I had contact with teachers and being a teacher. So I was very lucky in that respect. But I totally agree with you when you say that now, from a teacher's perspective, right? We have to be selective. We have to be careful and tactful. Otherwise, we might just, it could do more harm than good, right? Depending on the kind of
I agree.
feedback you provide. So yes, but again, a great professional can really help us speed up the process and make us become better, more competent, and more effective, not only speakers, but users of the language as a whole.
Yeah, because first you have to learn the words, then you have to learn how to join the words into a sentence, and then you have to learn the right pronunciation intonation, then you have to learn connected speech, then you have to learn other ways of saying the same thing so that you are progressing on the language. So it's really an overwhelming amount of things you have to learn. And if you have someone to help you, uh, you cannot measure an impact that a great teacher can have on a student.
Yes, yes, that's for sure, undeniable. And we were lucky, right? Because we had great teachers who really,
We were,
it
definitely
makes
were.
us make it doesn't it make you wonder, for example, if you had had other teachers, how different things could have been?
Yeah. And I would say
Yeah,
something important, Serge, that we had the luck of having teachers who had a passion for the language, who could see in
yeah.
their eyes that they loved the language and they loved what they were doing. So they were really an inspiration to us. Do you agree?
It makes a huge difference. I remember I had this student who was he's still an engineer actually, but by the time we had lessons, he hadn't finished his course yet. But he said that one of the things that really pushed him to study harder, it's because he noticed that I say he would say, it is clear to me that you have put a lot of effort into preparing this lesson. He said, I can tell that. And I think you mentioned the word analytical before. I believe he still is, but back then he was really analytical, and he would notice, for example, even the, because normally students don't pay attention to that, right? But he would notice the transition from one stage of the lesson to the next stage, and say, how can you make it look and sound so smoothly? Because the way you do this when you go from one stage to the other, it's so natural. And then he said, it really pushes me to start harder because I can see that, before the lesson, you spent a lot of time planning it so that uh, I can take advantage, right, of the lesson you're teaching. So it's nice. It made me feel great as a teacher, but it also got me thinking about the impact that I can have on students simply by preparing a good lesson, planning a good lesson.
Yeah, and the students, they feel it. They know that you prepared the class,
They do.
and they know that you are really concerned and you want the best for the students. The way you prepare the classes, so you have a clear view of what you want to do during the class, and then from one step to the other, um, and it motivates the student to be in the class. He says, "Oh, my teacher is paying attention to whatever I say. He's here correcting me all the time. He took a time to prepare this class." So it's a matter of respect
Yeah,
to be my best here.
definitely. Right. So to recap, so the three tips that we were and hopefully we're able to share today were number one, right? So the importance of exposure and input, comprehensible input. Number two, practice, the kind of practice that we consider effective. So it's not just any practice, but if you are selective and if you have someone to help you, practice can do wonders for your English. And then number three, the importance of having someone to guide you, give you feedback, and you know, I feel that it sounds like a metaphor, but I feel that a good teacher is someone who really takes you by the hand at the beginning and take you towards your goal. But then as you progress, as you become more and more autonomous, you feel that you become increasingly less dependent on your teacher. And as teachers, that's our ultimate goal, right?
Exactly. And if I could say something else to finish this podcast today is don't think about your student just as an English learner. Observe him as a Portuguese speaker. Which points do you think, as a communicator, he or she should improve in Portuguese? Oh, he's very shy, so he doesn't feel comfortable to expose himself or herself. Or whenever they are speaking Portuguese, they try to just say short sentences. So try to see how he communicates and how he interacts with the world in Portuguese so that you can help your student not just get a higher level of proficiency, but be a better person.
Definitely. Portuguese or any other language for that matter, right? Because as
Exactly. Yeah.
today we may have people from different
Yeah,
countries
I used
listening.
Portuguese because this is our context, but we can apply
Definitely.
this to any other language.
Great. Do I'd like to, well, thank you very much for having accepted to talk to me about this topic, which is, again, we could spend like 2 or 3 hours talking about this topic easily, right?
Easily, yeah.
But I think that's it for today. I hope everybody finds those tips useful. And if you'd like us to record more tips, well, any topic, let me know. And it'll be great to have Do again. Do again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Bye bye.
Bye bye, everyone.